Hey guys, Alan here, Solid Rock Bible Class. Hey, hope you got your coffee with you. I know I've got mine. And we're going to stay down the line. Don't forget to remember, we're going to continue with last week out of the book of Acts here. And I'm going to kind of start picking up in chapter 27, and we'll finish out the actual chapter here. So let's look at this. I'm going to kind of set the stage for this. Remember, this is Paul's voyage that he set off to Rome. So I'll start out with a little bit of storytelling with it, just so I don't have to read a bunch of scripture, kind of get it rolling here. But don't forget, it's cold. It's wintertime. Winter's approaching at this particular point. We know that it's getting dangerous as far as travel goes, and even the crew was looking possibly to find a place to kind of winter in here a little bit. And as they were sailing, they hit all of this terrible storm. Maybe something kind of like a nor'easter or something. Dangerous swells, massive waves, just beating waves were happening here. And they began to throw all the cargo overboard into the water. The next day, the storm, it continued. It got worse. We see them throwing the gear overboard. And the storm lasted for days. Absolutely no sun, no stars, nothing to navigate it all by here. And it was just this raging storm until finally all hope was gone. All the hope that they had, it was totally gone, that they were going to even survive this thing. And the thing that sailors want to avoid more than anything is about to happen to them. But God he speaks through Paul here. And the thing that they would want to do, they want to get off the boat before it hits the rocks. But of course, that's not God's plan. God's plan was stay on the boat. But the sailors are saying, hey, if I stay on the boat and it's shipwrecked, we will die. But God says, you must remain on the boat if you want to be saved. So we see that that those that stayed on the boat with Paul, 276, and we see of them that took and they ate food and got themselves nourished, because they knew it was going to be an extremely hard day going forward. And they went ahead at that point. They threw the rest of the food off the boat. Man, I can't get my words out. They threw the rest of the food off the boat, and they let it go ahead and head towards the island. They knew, remember, that it was getting shallower and shallower. And so we see that God is going to take and do some divine intervention here. So they crash. Of course, we know that everybody stayed alive that stayed on the boat. They had to do a little bit of swimming at the end, as far as either swimming or grabbing a board or something, but everybody survived. We also see here that the guards here, the centurions, they were very, very upset here that possibly they may lose some prisoners. So they was going to go through, kill all the prisoners, which, remember, Paul is a prisoner on this boat. And God intervenes there also. But, there was absolutely never any doubt here that Paul was going to survive in his own mind here, because, remember, the angel of the Lord, it took and it came to him and says, Paul, you have to stand there in Rome. You will be seeing Caesar. In verse 24, it says, you must stand before Caesar. And so I'm picking up now in Acts, the 28th chapter. And I'm going to pick up here in verse number 1 here. And it says, and when they were escaped, when they knew that the island was called Malta, the barbarous people showed us as no little kindness. But they kindled a fire and received us, every one, because of the present rain and because of the cold. And when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came a viper out of the heat and fastened to his hand. So let's look at this. Paul says to them before they ever start the voyage, you know, this is going to be an extremely dangerous voyage. Do you really want to do this? I see there's going to be a lot of harm here that's going to happen if you go through with this voyage. But what did they do? They went ahead, these mariners, and said, we know more than you do, Paul. You're just the preacher here, and you're the prisoner. We're not going to let, we're not going to let the inmates take and run the asylum, basically, they told him. So they went ahead and launched. They ended up with a shipwreck, of course. But Paul told them, if you will take and follow the directions that God's given us, we will all survive, which was exactly the opposite reaction of what they wanted to do on the boat. They wanted to all abandon boat. But they did, and they survived. Now we see that they're on the island, and the centurions are saying, hey, we need to kill these prisoners so that nobody escapes. But again, Paul takes and escapes this along with the rest of the prisoners because God intervenes again. And after all of this poor guy, Paul, he can't catch a break. He's been in prison. He's been stoned. He's been hungry. He's been in all kinds of storms. He's been in shipwrecks here. And after all this, now he's bit by this extremely viperous snake. And I was kind of looking up, I was just kind of curious a little bit about that word, that viper a little bit. And it's definitely a venomous type of a snake that would normally kill. I think it's kind of like, hey, the straw broke the camel's back here. It means that something here is just not right. But we see again, God is in control here. So as we look at this, I think we need to look at this in regards to sometimes ourselves. There's times that we finally get to that straw that broke the camel's back. Sometimes it's not even a big thing that happens. It's something really small, but it's a buildup of all of these things. And finally, we're wore down enough that, boom, it just snaps. This is where we need to realize we can't rely on our own strength here when things like this happen. But let's look at Paul. He wasn't working on his own strength. Paul was working on the strength of God himself. Paul was working on the strength of Jesus here. You see, Paul, he learned a long time ago that he couldn't do it on his own strength. He found out back on the road to Damascus he couldn't do it. He found out that his strength failed, but God's strength absolutely never failed through all of the shipwrecks and the stonings and everything else that happened. And we know that Paul even lived every day with some sort of a physical infirmity or pain or something here, and he prays 3 times for God to relieve him of it, and God doesn't do it, but he says, my grace is sufficient for you, Paul. And you know, that's the one thing we need to remember. God's grace is sufficient. He's sufficient for us too. In our everyday life, His grace is there, and it's enough. In 2 Corinthians 12:9 it says, and he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. What a state of mind here that Paul has. He says, God told me my grace is sufficient for thee. And he goes on and he says that Paul says, in my weakness, that's where God finds this strength and shows this strength. You know, and then he says at the end of it, that great mindset he had, he says, so I am happy, or I'm glad here to take and to glory in my problems, my infirmities. Why? So God's power could take and be shown. In Philippians, the 4th chapter, verse 13, he says, I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. And I think a lot of times, we don't go back and remember that particular voice. We can do that verse there. We can remember this, and it gives us strength that goes beyond our natural strength. See, when you trust God, we need to trust God all the way. Don't pick and choose when we want to trust God. See, Paul knew, like we should know, that God is faithful and God is able to take care of our problems. He's in control. He has a plan. So when the snake, it takes, and we see it latches onto Paul here, he doesn't crumble. He doesn't fall apart here. In verse number 4, let's look at, this is back in Acts the 20th chapter, verse 4. It says, and when the barbarians saw that the venomous beast hung on his hand, they said among themselves, no doubt this man is a murderer, who through he hath escaped the sea, yet that vengeance suffereth not to live. And he shook off the beast into the fire and felt no harm. So he just shakes it off. Now notice, these same people that saw him they saw him take and tell the mariners, this isn't a safe place or a safe time to sail. The same ones that were in their boat, and they hadn't seen the stars, they hadn't seen the sun, and these huge, huge waves, it was beating, and they're running into an island, and he says, an angel of God talked to me today, and said that if we remain on the boat, we'll be saved. And that happens. Now we see him with this venomous bite of a snake, and he takes and he shakes it off here. He doesn't have to say anything. He doesn't have to try to convince anybody anything, but notice they are taking and saying, oh man, he must have really done something wrong. Just because something bad happens to you, because something bad happens to a Christian, doesn't mean that God isn't taking and still in control, that he doesn't still have a plan. Notice here, as we talk about Paul, as I said, he shakes it off. He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't try to convince anybody, hey, I'm going to be okay. He doesn't take out his snake bite kit. He doesn't go to Facebook and start complaining about all the problems he has, right? He kind of does what we need to take and learn here. He just shakes it off. I think we learn a lot here about Paul, and I think we learn a lot about the God that Paul serves and the theology behind this. When the soldiers were worried about the wind, Paul wasn't that concerned, because he knew who controlled the wind. Paul knew that God was not going to let him go through all of this and through the shipwreck, and now he's not going to die of the snake bite. Paul was not surprised. He knew what was going to happen. He already knew God's plan. God had revealed this plan to him. So he didn't worry about the pain of this bite, and I'm sure it hurt. And I'm sure this same venomous beast would have killed in most cases. But God intervenes here. So maybe we can kind of look at it and say, when life bites you, we just need to sometimes shake it off. There's going to be these snakes here, and they're going to attack our faith, and they're going to attack our thinking. And when we take and actually take and serve God, and we start building a fire within our own lives, and we build a fire that other people can see in our lives, the snakes, they'll come out. You've heard of the of the Mississippi Squirrel Revival, I'm sure. It's one of my favorites of all times, put out by Ray Stevens. It's a little musical. In fact, I'll put a link here that you can take and click into off of the YouTube here if you want to take a fast look at it. But after this, we see this snake revival pretty much, I guess you could call it almost, because notice, Paul warns them about the trip, and they do it anyway. And yes, there's much harm. Paul takes and he warns them about how to survive the shipwreck, and guess what? He's right. Now he shakes off this venomous snake, and nothing happens to him. And now the people are starting to realize. At first, they thought he was a god. But of course, Paul let them know he wasn't a god. But let's look at what happens after this. Now, all of a sudden, Paul has credibility with them. Paul has a witness with them. And Paul is going to take and affect people on this island. In Acts the 28th chapter, down in verse 8, and it says, "And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and a bloody flex, to whom Paul entered in, and he prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. And when this was done, others also, which had diseases in the island, came and were healed, who also honored us with many honors. And when we departed, they laid us with such things as were necessary." Notice here, it wasn't just now the centurions and the fellow prisoners that were affected. Now we see that he's affecting the people on the island where they've crashed into. God had a plan of spreading his word right here and spreading it here with Paul. So I think what the takeaway really is exactly what I've kind of titled it is, don't forget to remember, God has a plan. And God's going to fulfill that plan. We just need to be able to take and rely on what he gives us. Remember, God's grace is sufficient for us. This is Alan, and I'll catch up with you later.